Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Tonight it's my privilege and honor to welcome Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. How are you?
I'm good. It's really good to see you.
Good, thank you. You too.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, no problem. It's been a while.
Yeah,
but
sure
I watch you all the time. I cover the action on the floor of the Senate.
Sure.
May I say right up front, you're one of the best we've ever had.
Thank you.
How's that for an endorsement?
Well, fair enough. I take the job very seriously. I will say when I was a legislator, excuse me, learning the procedural rules, learning what takes precedent over other things in terms of sometimes navigating a floor debate. Sometimes you make a motion to sort of slow things down or speed things up. It's good to know those rules, but I also have felt with everybody sort of losing faith in democracy, and I'm just going to say that broadly.
Right.
We could cast aspersions on this person or that person or whatever, but as a whole, whether people feel like government doesn't work, whether people feel like there's conspiracies, whether people just want to throw barbs, whatever it is, if we don't run a process that is clear, transparent, but also efficient and professional, that would only feed more into that.
For sure.
And so I try really hard to be level-headed. I've told John Bloomer when I first got in, I said, look, I'm not going to be someone who just rules something is germane because I like it. It's got to be, only if it's in the gray zone.
Right.
And, pretty close in the gray zone. Am I willing to even consider anything in one way or the other? Because really, things are pretty clearly germane or not germane. And if you start playing games with how you interpret the rules, then all the rest of it falls apart.
I love watching you and John. John Bloom, what's his title on the...
Secretary of the Senate.
Secretary of the... Okay.
It's a clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate.
I try to remember a license plate that somebody asked me, and it was for that job, but it wasn't Secretary of the Senate. I don't know whether... Anyway, you two have this rhythm that is really you can see it, and you can see how well it works, and things work smoothly, and I enjoy that.
When he's like putting the bill up, and I read it to the next, like boop, 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 you got to get it all done.
Yeah, no, it's really well orchestrated and very good, and you don't have too many people balking back, because that's happened too, where people have said, "Oh no," but it works really well. So anyway, thank you for being here. Just thought I'd throw that out right up front.
Sure.
So could you tell those who may not know you, how come I don't know, but a little bit about your years and your experience? And
sure.
You're running again.
I'm running again. I'm the lieutenant governor. This was my third term. I had a little break in there because I did run for governor in 2020. I started that race before COVID took over the world, and and the pier got short, my strides got long, and I got clobbered. Governor Scott did very well handling COVID. Our state, our communities did really well. We had huge federal money. We are a state that we can all be proud of, I think, with respect to how all of us worked together to handle that and try to keep as few people from getting severely ill or dying. But besides that, I started out way back. I actually ran for the House in '94 and lost by 59 votes.
Really?
Yep. So my first race was a loss. It was in Burlington. And I had seen Bernie speak in 1992 on the UVM campus, and that inspired me to sort of engage in that race. And from that, I met local people involved in the political atmosphere. But I lost in '94. I won in '96, and I served 7 terms in the House. And then I found land with my spouse, and we bought land. We left the Intervale, which in the last 15 years that we haven't been there, there have been 3 midsummer floods that have just wiped everybody out. And it's really devastating. And but we moved to Heinsberg, so I was no longer in the House district. And 2 years later, Hinda Miller did not run for re-election. And there was an open seat. And so I ran for the Senate, served 2 terms there, 2 terms in lieutenant governors, lost for governor, 1 term lieutenant governor, and here I am.
Here you are.
But it's more than running for office and winning or losing those things. It's really the work that you get done while you're there, and you were really dedicated to that work as well. And
I loved it.
It's really trying to digest all the material that's coming at you. It's working with your colleagues to either try to make something that you don't like less unlikable, or make something that you like be as effective and good and well done as possible. And I did that on a number of bills over the years, whether it was GMOs, I was sort of a dog on the bone there, cannabis reform, raising the minimum wage, affordable housing issues,
Marriage
lots of things.
equality.
Marriage equality, absolutely.
There was a lot of good things you did.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, in 2005, which was not the year we passed marriage equality, that was 2 years later we took it up, I was the lead sponsor with 5 other people on marriage equality.
Were you really? Good
Yep.
for you.
And then a couple of years later, when SHAP got in and had decided that they thought that was going to be the year, which was 2008, 2009, I think it was 2009, he asked, and I was more than happy to do it, if Mark Larson, who had done a lot of work
right.
on that legislation as a citizen activist, could be the lead sponsor. I think they also wanted a Democrat to be the lead sponsor, and I was a progressive. And I said, look, what party does this, whether I'm first or second, is irrelevant to the importance of the issue.
Right.
So we had Mark Larson as the lead sponsor, and I
Excellent.
was second.
Very nice. I wish I came to that issue late in life,
It's okay.
but I'm there.
Good.
And wish I had been there then.
I keep learning things.
Well, I have to give you one more compliment because you've got here cannabis reform.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was not in favor of it.
That's fair enough.
So you were in the cafeteria, and if you remember this, I'll be incredibly impressed. But I asked you, could you explain to me why you were in favor of cannabis? And do you know that you sat and talked to me, I would say maybe more than an hour, and say, who does this? You did.
Yeah.
And you explained it to me, and there was wasn't in any role that would benefit you or vote or do whatever. I just asked you. And I have told everybody about you doing that, and said there's absolutely no reason why you would have taken that amount of time. You just wanted me to understand. And I was always very impressed with that.
Well,
It got me a little closer.
That's fine. Well,
you did.
It's an interesting. My spouse and family are certainly frustrated by sometimes the amount of time I give to others,
Well,
and
exactly.
that I'm not
I
at
know
home,
that.
which
Yep.
is true of all of us who do public service. But to me, what we get through typical news is so abbreviated
Right.
that you can't learn the history, or you can't learn the background. You can't learn some of the other facts besides the one hot fact that makes everybody happy or sad or mad
Right.
or whatever. And if we can sit down and talk with people, and you just expressed it, you've told many other people.
I have, right.
Vermont is so small that if you do spend time with someone and you really give them the information, they will remember and they will share. They don't always have to agree or not agree. And I have just found over time that it develops a deeper sense of understanding of what's going on. Why do we do what we do? And that issue has tremendous, I'm sure I told you, tremendous history back into the 20s and the 30s and the paper industry and all these different things.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and I do remember most of it, but when we're watching, everybody's leaving the cafeteria, and there you and I are, and they're all looking at us going, what are those two up to? But anyway, so you have really accomplished a lot over the years. Pay equity, I think you mentioned, renewable energy, and medical aid in dying. That's certainly...
Which I assume you may not support. I don't know where you are on that issue. It's okay if you don't want to talk about it. It's a hard one.
You know me.
Yeah.
I do not support it.
Fair enough.
And my biggest one is 9-month abortions. That's that could get me going.
Right. You've told me that many times. The good news is that basically doesn't happen unless the fetus or the mom are going to die.
Right.
I mean, nobody chooses that as
someday I'll tell you my answer to that.
Fair.
But
okay.
But maybe
Fair
not
enough.
here.
Fair enough. Okay.
But anyway, I digress. So people know it's supposed to be a part-time job. But knowing you, I'm sure you just said to your wife, you probably spend a lot more than 20 hours a week. That's not much at all for...
Well, it's an interesting job in that it's very full-time during the session, just like being a legislator.
Right.
Off session, there aren't really any official duties you're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, you are still, my phone could buzz at any moment and say, guess what? You're governor now.
Yep.
So you are number one in line if something tragic happens
Yep.
and the governor can no longer do the job. So in that regard, you're sort of always on in a subtle way. And otherwise, it's really what you make of it in the off session. And most lieutenant governors have had other jobs. Brian Doobie was a pilot, if I'm not mistaken, in the airline industry. I'm a farmer. Some folks have said, in fact, even in this campaign cycle, they've said, well, I would make it a full-time job. It's like, well, there's certain things you can do. I'm attending all of the education reform meetings.
Right.
I'm zooming in on those and following those. I'm going to be putting out newsletters covering that topic to people about what are the deeper issues, like those 1 hour conversations, so that folks can get more than they hear, again, in the 1 minute news or 3 minute news story. So each year during the off session, I try to focus on something. Last year was my Banned Books or Books Worth Reading tour.
Yeah, I'm very interested to talk to you about that.
Sure. And this year I think it's going to be a lot around education funding and education systems, because what comes out of this is going to be the future of education in Vermont. And that is a significant, huge topic.
Did you, who picked the people that are on that committee?
A few different folks picked. The governor picked some folks, the speaker picked some folks, and the committee on committees, which is also part of my job.
I think if I were to pick, I'd pick some newer names. They seem to be people we've heard from before, and I'm worried that it's
going to be stale.
Yeah, it may not be. Maybe it's same old, and I've listened to a couple of the meetings. I just hope it's. I wish there had been, maybe it wouldn't take a lot, just one or two new ideas sticking in there that, because it's sort of the same cast of characters, all good people.
Well, that's the hard part is you want people with deep knowledge, because if you're going to really overhaul a system that's going to impact, 70,000 kids a year, you want that deep knowledge.
Absolutely.
You do want creative ideas to come in, and I think, each of those folks is also connected to a whole web of folks who are talking in their ears about, have you explored this? Would you think about that? And, we will see what happens.
They've certainly got the opportunity to do something with this group.
They do, and the question is how, I guess I would wonder, how big do the changes need to be, and what are they? Because every time you move something, and you remember this, of course, you move a piece here, and some piece moves over there. And do you change the requirements of our education system? Well, does that improve or decline the quality of education? What shifts do you make to the funding formula? And if you don't have the resources, what programs get cut? Do you close small schools? Do you close elementary schools? Do you combine high schools? Do you go from 50 districts to 1 per county? There's a lot of different ways that can go here. And one of the big arenas is a huge driving cost of education in the last few years has been the addition of, I believe, about 580 mental health counselors and sort of school counselors. And in other states, that would normally be paid for in the human services world. In our system, it's in education. And that is something that probably could have been done differently. I don't know whether it could have unilaterally been done by the governor or needed to be done with the legislature. So I don't really know where to place all that. But in every other state, that is typically human services, which is a different tax than the property tax, which is slamming people. Those 500 positions is about $50 million.
When I was in the legislature in the House Education Committee, I asked them to put in they wanted me to approve this bill, and I said, I'll only approve the bill if you put in a requirement that Human Services and Education get together and identify all of those items that should be normally paid out of general fund and not in property tax. And they had
Did they balk at that?
But they put it in, but it never happened. You know how that goes. Because it seems to me that if people, Vermonters, knew how much was in their property tax that should be technically in human services, they'd blow a gasket.
They would. Really and I'll get slightly political here, and I have a lot of respect for Phil, but Governor Scott. But on his watch for 8 years, this is what's happened. And he wags his finger at the legislature for the bill, you know as well as I do, that's an annual bill. It has to happen every year. It's the addition of all the budgets across the state. And then you say, well, if it's that much money that we need to spend, this is what the tax rate needs to be.
Right.
And unless a new funding source is established to take the pressure off the property tax, that's what happens. And I don't know if you know this, I've had one 30-minute meeting with Governor Scott. And that was at the summer of 17, after the first session when we were all new.
Oh.
He had already said, we're not going to work together. I think I've told you that part.
Yep. You mentioned that on on WCAX the other night.
Right.
About not being on his...
That's his call, you know, he's the governor, but I think there's other ways to make it be more productive. He said it wasn't productive under Shumlin. I'm like, fine, then let's make it productive.
Right.
So I said to him, let's, you and I, walk out hand in hand in a press conference and say, one of the things we want to do is look at the silo of human services, which at that time was about a $2 billion part of the budget, the silo of education, which at that time was about $1.5 billion. Together, they're 55, 60, 70% of the budget.
Right.
And I said, when you're working with families and kids, they're in our schools, both of these silos are working with the same people. Are there places where we have bureaucratic barriers, where we have double or triple sets of paperwork, where the human services knows something about the child, but they can't tell the teachers? Are there legal ways we can make that more possible for information? Because there's no reason, whether you're a Republican or a progressive Democrat, that looking for a more efficient system that addresses issues earlier for kids, which we know when you address a problem earlier, you solve it faster and the kids get back on their feet better. Why he didn't take that up, I don't, because I said this is more than a 2-year project. So we'd be holding hands and no one could chastise me because I'm doing it with you, and no one could chastise you because you're doing it with me. So we could be like, look, people, let's get rid of the chitter chatter and let's
do it.
Look at this stuff.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It was 8 years ago, and we could have done something about this stuff.
For sure.
I think we still can. Because
I was thinking about it back then. And,
right,
and
you already,
it's so obvious.
Yeah.
And this year, well, it originally came out 22% property tax, something ridiculous.
I think it was 18 to 22, somewhere in there. It was hard to know.
They got it down.
That's right.
Because I think they got a little nervous when people started calling.
Well, school boards started to pull it back. And then, so those numbers came in lower. And then the legislature found a few other places to generate revenue, taxes that wouldn't directly impact people as much as property taxes. And they got it down another 4% or so. But it's still huge. It's hurting people.
Yeah, it's really scary.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you're in a primary.
I am.
Yes, you are.
Folks can vote whether for me or others.
Yes, others.
Any day of the week, you can go to your town clerk when they're open.
Already, right?
Oh yeah, for the last it's 45 days, so it's been for the last month or so.
Oh, that's so. How do you campaign when people are already voting? I find that because people are doing it more and more.
Maybe. I don't know what the numbers are right now. I don't think tons have happened because really it's been such a quiet election season. I'm the only statewide official who's opposed in a primary, and that's barely gotten much attention. There are some legislative and House races that are pretty hot, but that doesn't generate a lot of news.
Right.
And so, I think the national political scene has really been on people's minds. But we'll see. I think people are starting to vote more. And one of the things you can do when you vote early that I've suggested is you can actually take the ballot home.
Yep, right.
You can turn on your computer one night of the week
and
go, what's this race? And look up the 5 names because, most of the time people don't know who most of us are.
Right.
As you said, more people know who I am, but that's because I've run statewide now 5 times.
You hand out carrots at parades.
I hand out carrots in parades.
I thought that was the coolest thing.
But yeah, so people can vote any day until August 13th, Tuesday at 7.
So this year, we've just talked about all the things that you worked on over the years, but this year it's a little different from a topic perspective. I think we've mentioned a couple of them. What are you hearing from people, and what are you running on? Well,
there's no doubt, folks. Well, it's interesting. I had expected in the parades, particularly not having the same party label as Phil Scott, that people would be yelling at us about property taxes constantly.
Right.
I have heard it, but not nearly to the level I thought. Sometimes it's 1 or 2 people a parade where I'll walk up and go to shake their hand and say, no way, you people did this to my property taxes. Now, I'll remind people, Lieutenant Governor doesn't actually vote on these bills. but we're all lumped together.
Right.
That's fine. So, but property tax is still the number one topic that comes up in debates, comes up in phone interviews, and so forth. Housing as a whole is huge, and we have the second highest second home numbers in the country.
Yeah, I heard that the other day.
Yeah, 17% of
Oh,
residential
I know where I
properties
heard it from. You were talking about a
in the
WCAX.
debate. It's 17% of our houses are second
Wow.
homes. And then on top of that, a lot of the long-term rentals have been bought up and converted to short-term rentals. Some by Vermonters, but mostly by investors.
Yep.
And, people are looking for housing, and folks are using housing as a huge profit generator. And I know people have different thoughts about that in terms of, well, if you can buy a property, that's
Right.
that's your money, do what you want with it. Others feel as though if we make property into a commodity that's more about business than about people having a home, what's that mean as a society? How do we
Yep,
think about
right.
other people? So that's a big one. And I've certainly said, and some people could disagree with me, but those that can own a second home can afford to pay a little more so everyone else can afford a
I don't
first home.
disagree, right?
And I co-own a second home with another couple in Roxbury. And if our taxes went up because that helped pay for money to make housing affordable, well, we're in a position where $1,000 or $2,000 would do that. Think about it. If there's 58,000 second homes and there was 1,000 more for each of those, that would be $58 million a year for
There you go.
investment in affordable housing.
Right.
Now, it wouldn't be a direct 1,000. Some might be 200, others
Right,
might be
right.
3,000. But second homeowners, I think, is a place where we could find resources to build affordable housing and more housing.
And there's land.
There is land with permitting, of which there are restrictions. That's
Right.
harder. But we also passed a law last year to try to make it easier in town and village centers,
Yep.
which I think, especially if we built smaller units for some, like single people or young couples
Right.
that aren't ready to do family stuff
Yep.
yet. But also, there's a lot of folks who are older living alone in big houses. And if you had village center housing where folks could carefully
Right.
walk to the local store
Right.
or the post office, not have to drive as much, make their lives a
Right.
little easier, a little closer to the pizza shop or
Yeah,
the
right.
sandwich shop in
Right.
town, that would open up some of those houses
Yeah.
for the families that want to move and live in Vermont. So the legislature tried to work on the permitting in town and village centers to allow for denser
Yep. Right.
development. So there's a combination of things
That's
that need
good.
to happen.
Remember
in some
Governor
of them.
Dean was really pushing that when he was in office about getting people to move into
Huh?
downtown, which makes sense.
And he probably faced
Yeah.
opposition then, but I think
Yeah,
there
right.
was a lot from the Democrats, and
Yeah.
there probably is now. I think there's more support for that
Yeah.
now, both from a climate and an economic
Do you know what I
perspective.
heard? I had Catherine Dimitrick, who's from the Northeast Kingdom, come here. She's the head of the planning. She
Planning,
said,
yeah.
she said, I've known her for 100 years.
Yep.
She said that the majority of homeowners are single people, boy, girl, whatever. There's no more family. There's no. I mean, it's all single up there. And I was just so surprised. And she said, so they've had to rethink what they're building and how they're building
Yep.
because it's single people that can't afford the McMansion.
People are building smaller,
Yeah,
much
right,
smaller.
smaller.
First of all, the cost of materials and labor is
Yeah,
just
it's ridiculous.
outrageous.
Yep.
But secondly, people are thinking about environmental footprint. People are thinking about
Right.
their surroundings, their neighbors. I know Catherine well. She actually was
do
a
you?
CSA member in my farm years
Oh,
ago.
no kidding. I love
Yeah,
Catherine.
she's really smart.
Yeah.
Really smart.
I called her and had it, and she knew it all, right? Just all the numbers and statistics.
I'm
She's been
sure.
there for a long time.
Yep.
But I was just surprised when she said that it's changed because it's now become single occupancy, which I thought was strange,
Yeah.
especially up in the Northeast Kingdom. I'd like a little company up there, just somebody to talk to.
Fair
I don't
enough.
know. Anyway,
Fair enough.
so I know one other thing that I don't know is on your radar, but Campaign for Vermont did a survey about what Vermonters are thinking, what's important to them, and for the first time ever, safety was in the top 5, and it blew our minds because
Yeah.
this used to be the safest state, blah, blah, blah. I never thought about anything.
Right.
I mean, I did lock my doors, but years ago, you never locked your doors. But I just do it. Not that I'm worried about it, but apparently Safety is a big deal these days.
Well, it's interesting. In the mindset of the general public, it's a big deal because we've also been hearing about it sort of like a drumbeat, whether it's from former President Trump and folks coming across the border who are criminals and rapists and so forth, which is factually inaccurate, but it's still put into our minds every minute of every day. And we have the drug problem. There's no doubt about it.
The fentanyl.
And a lot of that is, it leads to crime that is usually not physically endangering. It's usually breaking into cars or stealing things to pay for money to get the drugs. These are not good crimes. There is no good crime. But from a safety perspective, these folks are typically not causing physical harm to people. But as a whole, what's fascinating is that our crime rates, especially with serious crimes, are quite low. But we think they're much higher. So in a survey like that, what it says is people have this more on their minds. And so now you have to think about, okay, why? Is it because crime is up, or is it because people think crime is up?
Perception.
And perception. Perception is reality.
Yep.
And so both of these things are important to address, is the perception and the reality. And where the politics gets interesting is how do you deal with it? Some folks say, well, if someone does something, put their hands behind their back, throw them in jail, get them a court date, get them in prison. That works to a point, but it also costs a tremendous amount of money. And we don't really have a prison system that is designed for the reality that 95% of people who go to prison are going to come back out. Most people get a 1 month, 6 month, 2 year, whatever sentence it is. If it's not a life sentence, that person will be a member of the community again. And we do nothing to really work with people while they're in prison, while they're incarcerated, to give them the tools to be productive when they get out.
Just open up the door and say goodbye.
Here you go, here's your bag of goods and good luck to you. I hope you set up someone to come meet you and wherever you're going to live. Now there's programs like Dismiss House, nonprofit. There's people trying to pick up the pieces of this shattered system. But when you look at countries, particularly in Scandinavia, where folks have penalties for crimes, they often live in incarceral places, but they also still have jobs during the day. So they basically have to go to work, but come back at night. As long as they're not dangerous to society. And that way they pay they pay the price. They've got to go back to this not necessarily happy home situation. But they continue to work. They pay for some of I believe they pay for some of the incarceral costs, but they also can save some money. So when you get out, you're not starting below the bottom of the ladder. So there's a lot we can do there that I think would stop this churn that we have, which doesn't do anybody any good.
I totally agree. I'm going to do this really quickly. There's a program around that I participated in that sets you up. You just got out of prison. You've got to find a job, a home, a whole bunch of things, and report into your PO, right?
Sure.
I failed. I mean, almost everybody failed because it was overwhelming that you had 5
Check
days
off all these boxes.
in a new neighborhood, and it was ridiculous.
You don't know anybody.
No, and it was nobody helped you, and we all failed.
Yep.
There was a few that made it, and we just looked down on them and said, how
Who are you people?
Hey, yeah, really, get away.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a reality. Wake up, because you're right. The same happens with kids.
And a lot of the folks coming out have less education than you do.
Well, yeah.
Have less agency in society. Don't know where to call. They might not even have a cell phone that you might have been able to use.
There you go.
There's a lot of impediments.
It was terrible, and we all felt we learned a lot. That hour worth of programming, we learned a lot. And that's the same they do for kids in foster care when they reach 18.
Out you go.
That's it. See ya. But anyway, I'm glad that's interesting that you talked about safety that way. I think we're so inundated on TV with, all kinds of bad things. We think
sort of everybody who does bad things does the worst thing.
Right.
And, there are problems out there. Folks are impacted. We had our money box stolen from our farm. I mean, this happens, right? But that's because we have this substance use struggle all over the state.
And I'm sure you must have seen it in the legislature after COVID and after all the flooding. David, I don't know how these people and the kids, how they have recovered from all of this. And it keeps on
And it keeps
happening.
happening.
I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I was mucking out basements
Yeah.
in Barrie just, whatever, a week, 2 weeks ago.
Oh, yeah, I did it for a while, and it lasted an hour.
Yeah.
It was like lifting cement, that
It's
mud.
heavy.
I
It's
couldn't
heavy.
do it.
I'm still in sort of farm stage, but I don't know how much longer I'll be able to do that
No,
either.
I gave up after an hour. I said, go find me something easier to do.
Yeah.
So they gave me the power wash. But I wanted to also talk, I'm sure you're very supportive of this, and about climate resiliency. I was told that that's sort of the new word, which I really like better than any of the other climate crisis. It sounds to me more easily attained.
Well, it gives a
I
little
don't know
more
what
hope.
that means.
It's a little bit less imposing of how bad it
Exactly.
really is. So I have mixed feelings about it because
Oh.
what's going on is really bad.
No, yeah.
And we need to take some drastic measures. On the other hand, resiliency means, okay, how do we address what is going to happen
Right.
so that what is going to happen doesn't harm us as much? And there were a number of bills in the legislature this last
Yes.
year, river corridors, trying to really analyze what kind of rains in what areas will create the most horrific impacts downstream.
Right.
Are there ways to look at our river corridors and see if there's either wetlands that could be reestablished or even farm fields that could be
Used.
water could be
Right,
diverted
right,
onto
right.
to help lower the overall rate of flow, but then compensate those farmers for the loss because
Yeah.
obviously those
Right.
fields they're great soils and they used to be the fields that flooded all the time.
Right.
But we've bermed them up or we've adjusted the river flow so that doesn't happen anymore. What that does is just channels the water more and more concentrated in a very narrow path. And we saw what happened here in Montpelier, and we've seen it all over the state. So resiliency is about saying, okay, what steps can we take? Larger culverts, which we started
Right.
learning with Irene.
Right.
You know, Governor Shumlin and I think it was flood czar Sue Minter. I don't remember what her name was, but
yeah,
not
that
her
was
name,
Sue.
but what
That
the
was Sue,
it was
yeah.
Sue. But I mean, what the title? It wasn't
Yeah.
flood czar.
She
but
was
it
all
was
over the nation talking about-
recovery czar,
yeah,
maybe.
right.
You know, they really fought with FEMA to say, no, you can't put the same culvert size in.
Right.
This is going to get worse.
Exactly.
So part of resiliency is recognizing and owning what the science is actually saying. And the science is saying more of this is going to happen.
Yep.
So therefore, we have to make those investments in those culverts.
Yep.
We have to think about, are there places where houses shouldn't be anymore? And these are tough decisions. But
Right.
but if your house is going to wash away anyway, at some point,
In the blink of an eye.
yeah. But the problem is right now as well is they don't really get paid for the house, the value of the house. And so then someone says, well, I'm not going to move out if I'm going to get
Right.
30 cents on the dollar for the
Right.
house because I can't afford another house in
Right.
Vermont. So whether it's federal money or state money, that's another tricky piece of this puzzle.
EPA isn't too quick on giving money back, are they?
EPA or FEMA?
FEMA, I'm sorry. Oh,
Yeah.
apologize, EPA. FEMA,
Yeah.
sorry. FEMA is not too swift.
Well, there's a lot of stories right now about how much money they've spent administering money and running programs versus just getting money out the door.
Exactly.
Which I'm going to talk about that for a second because
do.
one of the things that I remember growing up from my memories of the mid-late 80s on was people talk about waste in government and waste in government and waste in government and how bad government is, right? This was a repeated drum
Right.
over and over again. So what happened was there became more and more political pressure to constantly document every single penny where it goes. Well, there's two sides to that coin.
Right.
Because how much loss was there in reality? Because actually it's a pretty small number. It's almost like crime.
Right.
When certain think tanks and people put out information over and over saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, everyone says, it's a problem, even if it really isn't.
Right.
Or
I get
it may be, but it's a small one. So the waste in government was a pretty small issue. But we now have created so many layers of bureaucracy to get that money out the door to make sure it's spent properly that we're probably spending more money on bureaucracy than we were losing from the money that would not get spent quite the right way. Now, nobody should be stealing money. Anytime there's embezzlement, those folks should get slapped hard because that's public tax dollars. People pay into the system to make the system work. That's just outrageous. But part of it is, creating so many layers of review that why not just get the money out to the people that need it? They're not going to frivel it away. They've got
They
real
need
costs.
it. Yeah.
Huge costs. That's my 2 cents on.
I am surprised. When I had the radio show, they kept asking me to come on, and they were talking about how much money they had given out. But yet I hear so many people that haven't gotten it yet. And, they're living off of people's couches, and
that's from last year's flood.
Yeah,
still.
that can only last a little while.
Yeah.
And some people here in Barrie, right before this last flooding, they just finished
I know.
the work from the previous flood. And I mean, really, these poor people.
Well, I think about them. I think about my friends who farm in the Intervale or along different parts of the Winooski River or other rivers that have flooded. And, rebuilding once is hard enough.
Yeah.
2 years in a row? I can't imagine it.
Right.
Can't imagine it.
And just watch your whole future just wash down the...
Yeah.
It's just so... Oh, and the Plainfield got really... I've been looking... I haven't gone up there, but the pictures are just
The
devastating.
pictures and then now St. Johnsbury.
Oh, yes, I just saw that
And
yesterday.
up that way, yeah. And towns around. It's
do
not
me a
just
favor,
St.
though. I
Johnsbury.
know you said you don't like resiliency, but for
No,
people,
I don't dislike it.
For people
but
like me, that helps me. I'll listen.
Mean, we need the word resiliency as well. We just can't make the other words disappear.
No, I'll agree with that, but I will listen to you talk about resiliency because I think I can do something about that.
Right.
But I can't do something about the climate crisis.
It's too big.
What is that? And this is Vermont.
Yep.
I mean, we could stand on our heads and we wouldn't change that needle one bit because we're teeny tiny. But resilient, we can.
What's that?
Resiliency, we can.
Resilience you can do, one step at a time. This culvert
Right.
might save that road, et cetera. So it's a tangible scale. I do think it's important to recognize, though, that there are people who have far less ability to do something about it all over the world who are doing more than we are on an individual basis. There's a couple people in a part of Mexico who have been planting trees for years. And there was a sagebrush sort of desert-like area, and they've planted whatever million trees. And that area is now creating its own rain because there's enough plants breathing and emitting transpiring water that they now, because the temperature changes, also create rain. Now, and so now it's growing naturally when it had to take a lot of work to get it started.
Right.
And so, never forget that sort of repeated small acts can really add up. So whether it's small acts by an individual Vermonter, small acts by the state as a whole, there are people all over the world with far fewer resources than we have who are doing something about it. So to me, when people say we can't do much because we're so small, we all have to do it.
Somebody tells me what to do, I could do it.
Yeah, fair enough.
The only time I ever did something was I went to a culling exercise at the food bank.
Yeah.
And all this ugly looking food came in and they taught us how to cut it down. And at the end of the day, we had bags of good food.
Right.
And I thought, wow, I know what I do with the original bag at home.
Right, and now you realize how much good food there is.
Food for a couple of days here, so
well,
that changed my life completely. Yes.
I appreciate that because we bring tomatoes to market, and sometimes they've got a split. Well, frankly, they split when they're like the most full and juicy and great.
Exactly.
The key is don't buy all split ones because 3 days later you're gonna have rotting tomatoes on your counter. But if you're gonna eat the first one in a day or two, grab the split one and eat them before they go. That last little bit goes bad. In the United States, we throw away about 30% of the food that's produced.
Oh.
And that's for lots of reasons. At restaurants, they have all you can eat, and people always take more than they can.
Right.
Restaurants serve big servings. They want you to feel like you're getting your money's worth, although that's been changing some because costs are so high. But if food doesn't look perfect, people won't buy it.
Right.
So one thing people can do is buy imperfect looking food. I mean, a carrot that has a twist to it is still fully edible.
Right.
You don't buy something that's got a huge, soft, rotten spot. No one has to do that.
You know what kills me about talking about food? What is it now? We are 1 in 4 people deal with food insufficiency in Vermont, an agricultural state. Drives me crazy.
Yep.
And that number hasn't improved over the years. It's going the wrong way.
Well, and the price of housing, all these things come together.
Right.
So you're food insecure when your housing costs go up because you have less money to buy food. So in some of the debates I've had with my challenger, we have talked about how so many things come back to housing.
Right.
Your health, your mental health,
Right.
your food insecurity,
Yeah.
all these things.
That in an agricultural state, that just makes me crazy. But that exercise of culling the food, I do that at home all the time now. Anyway, so could you mentioned that you were talking, and I think it was one of the things you were on television about democracy, the issue of democracy, and the recent banned book, your recent banned book tour. What was that all about? Good for you.
Well, thank you. There's been an effort. It was a louder effort a couple of years ago, but we heard out of certain states and certain municipalities real pushes to ban certain books or materials from schools.
Yep.
Now, it's important to realize that librarians already filter. I mean, there's billions of books. The school library has a few thousand or 10,000 books. There are massive filters on what's going into the school in the first place. And librarians are trained. They understand the grades. They understand the mental acuity of different grades and so forth. But there has been a concerted effort, and it's actually, there's a small group called Moms for Liberty. It's a few dozen people that are the main group of that.
Yeah.
They actually are responsible for more than half. I can't remember the exact number, so I'm just going to say more than half of the books that are banned in districts all over the country. Now, in Vermont, we hadn't yet had a successful push to ban a book. On the other hand, we had statewide officers from Governor of Texas, Governor of Florida, really talking about book banning and indoctrination of kids to become gay and to this and to that, or to feel guilty for slavery and all these other things, which no one gets taught to be gay. You're either you're either gay or you're not.
Right.
And some people are at various places along a spectrum. We used to very much think like you're straight or you're gay.
Right.
And it turns out actually there's a lot of different variations. Right. Most people are fairly straight or fairly gay or completely whatever. But there's a spectrum.
Right.
But the idea that you can be taught to be gay is just really not the way it works. And similarly, no one who's alive today is responsible for slavery.
Right.
You weren't here.
That's true.
But there are people that say, well, when kids learn about it, they feel guilty for it. It's like, well, you don't have to feel guilty for something you had no act in, no role in.
Right.
But it's important to know about it because it's the foundation of so much, kind of like when we were talking about cannabis earlier.
Right.
If you don't know all the history behind something, then you don't really know why we're in the situation that we're in today in terms of disparities of wealth, disparities of being put in jail, all those different things. So because these governors were really talking up the idea of limiting what could be offered in schools, I felt it was important as a statewide officer to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to be silent. I'm going to stand up for the fact that books that are being banned, some of which might be very uncomfortable for people to read, but others are books that have been literally Pulitzer Prize winning books. I read from Toni Morrison, Beloved. It's a Pulitzer Prize book.
And we're
and in some schools in this country it's banned.
Wow.
And so I did this banned books or books worth reading tour. I did it in schools, mostly in public libraries and bookstores. And we would have myself as a lieutenant governor as a guest reader, and then 1 to 3 other guest readers. They were either members of affected communities or authors. We have Vermont authors who have had their books banned. A lot of Vermont authors. And some of them have had books banned. And so we would each speak a little bit to the topic for a minute or two, read a few passages, and then pass the torch. So 3 or 4 of us, 15, 20 minutes. And then we would have the remainder of the hour be for a community conversation. Why do you think books should be banned? Why don't you think they should be banned? And when you look at the categories of books, out of all the books that are banned, about 40% of them are LGBTQ+. About 40% are race and history of race. And about 20% are coming of age. So when you're a teenager going through puberty type books. And all of those are topics that we can and should learn about.
Right.
You can't live in a bubble.
Right.
And one of the best examples of part of a conversation we had was I was in Manchester at the Northshire bookstore.
Oh, which is a great bookstore.
Great bookstore. And we had a room of 40 people, maybe 50. Was it? It might have been Norwich. But either way, anyway. And this person who I've known, actually, she used to work at the State House in the cafeteria or somewhere. She used to be a regular person.
Right.
And so we knew each other. She was older. She had her grandson who was 10 years old. And she said, look, I just don't think these things should be taught, et cetera. And I said, well, parents have a right to not have their kid use a certain book. And you can talk to your teacher to use a different book to a certain age for the child. But the grandson, who was 10 years old, said, all my life, in my religion, I've learned of a number of things that are deadly sins, and pride is one of them. And now we're getting taught pride in school. How am I supposed to square I don't think he said square the circle because that's a 10-year-old, but he essentially was reflecting,
right.
I've been told pride is bad, and now I'm in school being told pride is good. How do I work with that?
Right.
And I paused and I thought, that's a really powerful question. It's a really important question. And I realized what you start to know over time is that words often have multiple definitions.
For sure.
And I said, so pride in the sense of, I am the best, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than everybody at everything, I'm the cat's meow. That form of pride is really not a very good characteristic to have. It's not true. No one's the best at everything. And so it's teaching you to be humble, right? But another definition of pride is simply being proud of who you are, being happy with who you are. And so I said, there are a lot of people who have been bullied or haven't seen themselves reflected in books or stories and feel like they're isolated or they're a marginalized person. And all pride is saying is, you're a real human being. You have a right to be who you are.
Right.
And you can be happy with who you are. Be happy with who you've been born as. And that's a different energy. That's a different meaning. And, I don't know whether that young man in the moment went, Eureka, you're right. Of course he didn't.
Yeah.
But sometimes I use the farming analogy.
Yeah.
I planted a seed for him to think about these different definitions of pride.
Right.
And I think the whole room was able to think about that.
What do you think the whole reaction was to that tour? Because it's a great discussion.
There were great discussions. We talked about knowing our racial history, knowing, seeing yourself in a book. I had a high schooler talk about how one of the books that's very controversial, called Genderqueer, has been in the news a lot. This person said, I saw myself. I finally understood who I was by reading that book, because nobody ever talks about people like me. The norm is, oh, Bobby's dating Susie.
Right.
And if you don't date someone or read about people dating people of the same gender, then you never see yourself. And you go into depression. A lot of people commit suicide. And they really talked about how it really saved them to read that book. But the discussions were good. And, online, it was pretty ugly sometimes. I've been called all kinds of things,
Really?
A pedophile, a groomer, just because I was saying these books are worthwhile books to read. You're not teaching somebody to do things that aren't what they'd eventually be inclined to do, hopefully in consent and with a willing partner and all that. These are the conversations we have to have. It's about consent and about respect for a partner and always listening to your partner and so forth. But if I take a bunch of hits and people who are cowards to say it to my face and they put it on some screen somewhere, so be it.
Well, I think that's a great discussion to have, and it was good for that kid, the young man, that he had you to bat things off of, because otherwise he may not be able to put it into perspective.
May not be able to figure it out.
Yeah,
and,
right.
And I think it's right if he's taught that pride and gluttony and some of the,
all those 7 something deadly sins or
whatever they are. But it's actually some pretty good lessons.
Yep.
I'm not an overly religious person, but there's a lot of aspects to religion that are really teaching us how to be good people.
Right.
How to be good people to our neighbors, how to care for those who are struggling, etc.
I have to tell you, I'm going to do this really quick. My daughter was in 4th grade. She brought home a book, and she came down to me, and she said, Mom, what is a piss pot? I said, Stacy, why are you asking that? And I read this book, and I went nuts. For a 4th grader, this was not a book that she should be reading. So, off to school. And they gave me this, oh, now everybody, look, everybody looks at the books, blah, blah, blah. But they came back to me a couple of weeks later, and apparently it's in a series of books that are for high school kids to be taught in class, so that it was talking about people that were very poor and how they lived, and I didn't mind that she knew it, but I would want her to be in a group to talk about it. So the poor kid, the rest of the school year, the librarian wanted to see every book she brought home, and it was like, see Dick run, see
basic, boring.
Oh my God. She said, Mom, they won't let me take anything out. I said, all right, never mind, we'll deal with it. But they were afraid they were going to. I only did it once,
right?
But I just thought it wasn't, and it turned out it wasn't supposed to be for them. It was supposed to be for in high school. So, but that was my only experience.
And in some cultures around the world, you have a chamber pot.
Well, you do, and I know what it is.
Right.
But you should be able to explain it because this was definitely about poor people and how they lived, and it was probably the truth for sure, but you should have it couched in some other discussion. So
people can understand it maybe without feeling guilt or whatnot, although people need to understand how our economic circumstances.
Yep, and I don't disagree, and I agree with exactly what you're saying, and as long as they have some place to ask those questions.
Yeah, yep,
an adult to ask it of. Why did you ask about a piss pot? Hello. So anyway, let's talk a little bit. We only have a few minutes left.
It flies.
What do they do these days? Because when the governor left the state, it went to you. Do they still do that?
Yep. The governor's people usually inform me 2 to 3 minutes before he leaves the state, and they let me know when he crosses the border getting back into the state.
Because that was a big discussion when Lieutenant Governor Doobie was in the position, that with the technology and stuff, that the governor can go to Alaska.
And still can communicate.
And can communicate, so it's not like years ago when you left the state.
But even letting me know,
still doing it.
The letting me know is a bit of a formality. Obviously, if something happens, they have communication, and the governor would be making the call.
Right.
Just use these resources here, use those resources there. But technically, if the governor is out of state, I'm acting governor. And there was an instance where we had an individual from New York in our prison system, and you're only allowed to hold someone for, I think, 30 days.
Right.
Especially if it's a cross-border situation. And while he was out of town, the governor was out of town, the papers needed to be signed for this person to be extradited across the border.
Oh.
And the governor has to sign that.
Right.
So that you can't do over the phone.
Right.
So twice now, I have signed a document that has led to an individual being transported back to New York.
Interesting.
They were different people, but
and
that was as a lawmaker, it's very interesting because you pass a law and it's about a set of principles that everybody has to live under.
Right.
It's usually not specific to an individual. My pen to paper was about, John Doe, whomever, who supposedly did X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And if you don't sign this piece of paper, they're back on the street.
Whoa. Sign that paper.
Because you can't hold them anymore.
Right.
And if you don't sign this for them to go back to their state. I did sign both of them. But it was a little bit interesting because I was basically told within about an hour, this needs to be signed before the end of the day. It's 4:00. You better get it signed.
Wow.
And so I didn't have time to research who the person was, learn more about it. I could read the file right there. But those are the two sort of official things.
Right.
And I've always wondered, it would be helpful to get more notice because, for instance, one time a few years ago, the governor was leaving the state, but it was for a weekend. I was also going to Maine.
Oh.
The Secretary of State, who's number 3, or maybe the Treasurer is number 3, was out of state.
Oh my!
The fourth person was out of state.
Oh.
And so if you have a days or two notice, you can start to make sure everybody in order is around. Oh, the speaker was out of town. So it's the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and then I think it goes to the treasurer, the secretary of state. And so it's just kind of one of those things that makes you chuckle a little bit about it's not like I'm going to go do something nefarious. Now, it did happen in North Dakota. 2 Republicans, one signed a document about the southern border while
Right.
the other governors, like they were like
Oh,
this.
no kidding.
And they got into all kinds of kerfluffle. I'm just not going to do that.
No, no,
you
right.
can disagree with me politically all you want. I'm going to respect
Yeah,
the
well.
chain of command and the system.
There was quite a, when Doobie was in they were
Who
quite
was,
the
was
discussion.
Doobie with Shumlin or was Doobie with Douglas?
Douglas.
And they didn't, well, yeah, I guess not.
He just thought when he walked in and, just said, well, here I am. And
Right.
they're like, no, we have him on the phone. But it was just something they should have worked out, and I'm sure they did after a while.
Right.
That's really funny. But in my husband's day, he used to be the one that would meet Snelling at the border, and they transfer, and then he's in the state, so he's back in charge.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's
no
cool.
kidding.
But they really were serious back then.
Did they transfer the governor to a different state's detail?
No, they would just meet them and escort them.
Oh, and escort them back.
Because they wanted to make sure he had more
Extra,
than extra help.
Yeah, it's funny. I go to lieutenant governor meetings, and some of the lieutenant governors have 2 or 3 detail with them, and I don't have any. They sit there and go, nobody in this random part of the country is going to know who I am.
Yeah, right.
Even if I'm wearing a
Exactly.
suit. Plenty of business people wear suits. And the last meeting I went to was at actually Myrtle Beach, and I went to this restaurant. The night I landed, like people are arriving the night before, and people had texted and said, "Oh, meet here. We're having dinner and a beer." And I walked in, and this table of 4 people. This person looks at me and go, "You the lieutenant governor of Vermont?"
That's funny.
They were Vermonters.
Oh,
2 of them were
that's
visiting
excellent.
friends, and
You never know.
So, but still, as a whole, like those people are not going to suddenly be like, "Oh yes, and I hate you. Oh, and I have a
right.
weapon. Oh, and I'm going to cause you harm."
How they only know.
I'm always
That's
kind of
funny.
chuckling that some folks have 2 or 3 detail. I'm like, nobody knows who we are.
Well, Governor Shumlin used to go to an island, and he sometimes nobody knew where he was because he would go this. And I said to him, you can't do that. He goes, I said, don't they know who you are? He goes, no, they call me Pete. Hey Pete.
Yeah.
And that's it. He said, I walk around, nobody knows who I am. He said, I love it.
Right.
So there you go.
There you have it.
Anyway, so have you, 55 seconds left, have you had to weigh in on when it's tie vote, you weigh in? Have you had to do any of that?
I think in my first term I had a tie vote. I'm remembering there was a tie at some
Whoa,
point.
because you have to know the bills
And
every...
exactly, and I don't really remember what it was at the time. Once in a while there's amendments that are going to be close, and I try to ask around, like, what do you think your vote total is?
Right.
Because I want to know ahead of time. I don't want to
sure.
suddenly go, oh, I wasn't paying attention. Now I'm an up or down vote on this thing. But it very, very rare.
That's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
And the bills are passing by you right and left. And
Yeah, but usually those votes aren't so sudden. Those votes are hot
right.
topics, controversial, and ultimately, you just want to know if it's going to be a tie or not.
Well, the only last comment I have is you're going to have, when you win in your back, you're going to have your hands full, all the old guys that
There's
are
a lot
left.
of new people.
Wow, David.
There will be 15 or 16 new people.
Whoa.
In all likelihood.
Good luck with that
between last biennium
orientation.
and this biennium. Well, some of them will have 1 term under their belt.
Yeah.
But that's a big turnover.
It's all this history stuff that you just need to know.
Yeah.
And,
it's one of the
Jane
reasons I've
Kitchell-
argued between me and my opponent in the primary. I think experience matters.
Yeah, Campion is the one I'm very upset leaving. He was an excellent chair. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for coming on. It's so much fun to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Thank you for listening in. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites.